Hello! Welcome to UnDrowning, where I share my story of surfacing after years of drowning my soul with alcohol and how I found the love, liberation, and purpose waiting for me above the water. I'm Noelle, and today we are going to dive quite a bit more deeply into my personal history with alcohol to sort of give you some context, some more of an understanding of what my struggle was like and how it brought me to where I am today. So, I've been having sort of a hard time with this episode as I've been trying to figure out what information about my past is actually necessary or relevant. I mean, technically it's all relevant, but since my lore is rather extensive and carries some darker, more disturbing themes, I'll likely create a separate space or outlet for more raw and shadowed aspects of my story. So for now, I'll do my best to keep this as light as I can so that it is more easily digestible and relatable. That being said, this episode does contain discussions of mental health struggles and some experiences of domestic abuse. Listener discretion is advised. Please take care of yourself, and if these topics are triggering for you, you may want to skip this episode or return to it when you feel ready. So, first, I actually want to talk about something seemingly entirely unrelated, but to me feels so profound and feels like such a powerful symbolic mirror to my current experience and of the story that I'm sharing in this podcast. So, about a month and a half ago, I went to the city to start a new job, and on the outside wall of this building, right above the entrance, was a Luna moth. I was thrilled by the sight of her there because it just feels like such an obviously good omen. For anyone who's unfamiliar with moth symbolism or who's only heard of the more basic generic interpretation of what moths symbolize, which is that they signify or represent death, that is true, but they represent death in the same way that the 13th card in the major arcana of tarot represents death, which is in almost every case not meant to be taken as literal physical death, but as the archetypal symbol that speaks to the process of transformation, of a transition from one way of being to another, or one chapter of life to the next. As a symbol, death is not about the finality of endings so much as it's about how these endings always simultaneously serve as new beginnings, or at least the catalyst for them. It's about the process of shedding what no longer serves our highest and best good, whether that means leaving a job or career behind, restructuring the dynamic of relationships, or even leaving a relationship, even just releasing toxic or addictive thought patterns that have kept us stuck or stagnant. Death is about the importance of letting go and the willingness to let go so that we can create space for the things that are meant for us, things that are more in alignment with where we are now on our journey, or more in alignment with where we're headed. Death is a reminder of the cyclical nature of life and the wisdom and beauty of impermanence. These symbols of death are meant to encourage us to embrace the inevitable transformations that we will ultimately be thrust into throughout our lives. Death is actually one of my absolute favorite cards to get in a tarot reading because it indicates a renaissance, a time of renewal and rebirth. And all I have to do is be willing to surrender to it, be willing to release and shed the habits, patterns, thoughts, beliefs, whatevers that aren't serving me anymore. So, all that being said, I was obviously really stoked to see this Luna moth just hanging out over the entrance of this building. I could tell that she wasn't in the best shape as her like tails or streamers You know how Luna moths have like the long bits that come down on the bottom of their wings? Hers were kind of tattered, and she was still in the exact same spot when I left for the night. But I thought she could just be resting or even maybe just naturally nearing the end of her rather short lifespan. Luna moths actually only live for about a week. They emerge from their cocoons without any mouth parts for eating, and their purpose is simply to mate and continue on the cycle. But anyway, so she was still there in the exact same spot when I arrived the next day and when I was leaving at the end of that night. She was on the ground, like off to the side, and there were two guys working security, and they were actually talking about killing her to put her out of her misery. Because I guess she'd apparently been there for like 4 or 5 days at this point, and they could tell she couldn't fly. She really couldn't go anywhere because she would have moments where she would like start to flap her wings and flutter like she was trying to lift off, but she couldn't. Um, and she eventually just ended up on the ground on the concrete of the entrance to this building where she definitely was at risk for being trampled. But I told the guys, I was like, no, don't kill her. I'll take her. And at first I thought I would just bring her out to a grassy spot or put her in a tree or just somewhere out in a more natural space so she could just die peacefully in nature. But pretty immediately I realized that if I did that, then she would pretty certainly get eaten by some critter. So I actually love bugs and I also really love dead things. I have many dead bugs in my cabinet. I have moths and butterflies, cicadas, things like that. I also have tons of animal bones. I've got deer vertebrae, snake vertebrae, a cat skull, raccoon skull, fawn skull. I have a raven skull, antlers, teeth. I honestly just find it all really beautiful and feel like by displaying these things intentionally, I'm honoring the life and death of that creature. So I'm sure there are many people out there who might find that really strange or even disturbing, but I find joy and comfort in collecting these things and feel more connected to nature and the natural rhythms and cycles of life. I see it as a way of celebrating life, even. So, anyway, basically, I realized this moth was going to die anyway, and I might as well bring her with me, where she'll be safe and can die a peaceful death, and then I can display her beautiful bug body in my magnificent cabinet of curiosities. So I scooped her up and started walking to the parking lot with my friend who I was carpooling with. And as we're walking, I'm watching the Luna moth sort of wriggle and settle herself down into the palm of my hand. And she just starts laying eggs. I was really startled at first. I actually thought she was pooping on me, even though I know they don't eat, but but we get to my friend's car and she actually has this perfect little container. I don't know if it was like a makeup case or something, but it's a perfect little container with a lid. So we put her in there for the ride home. And when I got back to my house and opened the box, she had laid like almost maybe 100 eggs. There were so many. So suddenly I've become the caretaker for so many Luna moth babies. My husband looked up what to do online and how to raise caterpillars, and it was actually really straightforward and didn't really require anything that we didn't have aside for like an actual caterpillar cage for when they got big enough to need it. But yeah, so for the last month and a half, I've been raising little baby Luna moth caterpillars. Obviously, not everyone survived. We have 10 now who have made it to what I suspect might be the final instar, which instar is just the word for the different stages that the caterpillars go through before they build their cocoons and become moths. But yeah, I think they're either in their final instar or very close to it because some of them are so big now. They look so plump. Anyway, it just feels really special to me that in saving this moth from being squashed by men or eaten by a hawk, I was rewarded by being given this incredible opportunity to care for her babies and help make sure that she was successful in her one purpose of continuing the cycle. Anyway, thank you for sticking with me through this tangent. I know it may have seemed a bit off topic, but I feel like it really ties into the themes of transformation and rebirth, which to me are key themes in recovery. And I just think it's a really magical and powerful reflection of where I'm at in my life right now. So I really just wanted to share that with you. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. Without going into too much depth, I'll just say that my childhood was traumatic. It wasn't traumatic in ways that were obvious from the outside, I don't think. And it wasn't traumatic in ways that I could understand as a child, which, I don't think that I think for the most part, most children don't understand they're experiencing trauma when they are. But the central reason for this trauma was my father's drinking. I actually don't have much memory of my childhood, really at all. I have some random vivid snippets here and there, some of which are entirely benign or even pleasant. My mom and dad were together all through my childhood, and we did a lot of stuff as a family. I have some memories of vacations and road trips that we took to get there and back. I remember some family dinners and school mornings with my sibling in the kitchen. I also remember hearing my parents sometimes talking quietly at night and sometimes hearing the front door and then the car start and pull away. And I remember going out and seeing my mom and asking her where my dad went. And she would say, "Oh, he just went out for a drive." But she seemed sad. I was so little and far too young to know anything about alcohol or drinking, but I could tell that something was wrong in those moments. And, I couldn't even tell you how many times that happened. It could have happened many, many times, or it really could have only happened a few times, and my brain just kind of put those memories on repeat because they stuck out as something to note. But I just remember this theme of my dad going out for a drive and my mom being sad, which, of course, obviously I learned later in life that from my mother telling me that he would be they would be arguing and she would be trying to stop him from going out to go buy alcohol. So I'm guessing he would have already been drinking at that point and she'd be trying to stop him from getting in the car and driving while under the influence and continuing his binge. I also remember extremely vividly my siblings' hatred for my dad. From the time we were both really young, I was probably about 5 when I started really noticing this, which means they were around 7 years old, which I don't know. I just feel like 7 is such a young age to be feeling and expressing such intense disgust and disdain for a person, especially a parent. The instances of this kind of interaction that are the most clear in my memory are from mornings before school. My sibling and I would be in the kitchen with our mom. We'd be having our breakfast at the island counter. And then my dad would come in. And for some additional context, my dad was like the quintessential morning person, woke up at the crack of dawn or well before it, depending on the time of year, and was just bright eyed and bushy tailed off the rip. So he would come into the kitchen with this really chipper, almost goofy attitude and greet us in a sort of sing-songy voice to say good morning. Now, the rest of us were not morning people. I know I was always dragging before school, feeling really groggy and not particularly ready for the day like my dad seemed to be. But I don't really remember his morning energy starting to bother me as completely obnoxious until I was a bit older. But what I do remember is my siblings' reaction to him, as if every word they spoke in his direction was like they were like spitting poison at him, just seething with hatred. My dad would sometimes come up behind us and place his hands on one of each of our shoulders as he would be saying good morning as a way of expressing affection. And my sibling would recoil immediately and hiss out some version of, "Don't touch me." And this went on throughout my entire upbringing and really until my sibling and I both moved away from the home. They always maintained their unwavering loathing for our father and still do to this day. Obviously, I can make sense of that now, but as a young child, I didn't understand. And for so long, I was too young and too innocent to even notice any of the dysfunction, really. I didn't have any conscious concept of anything being awry, and anything that maybe did play out in front of my face went right over my head. Apparently, my dad had been struggling with alcohol addiction my whole life, but I had no idea. It was kept secret from me for as long as possible until there was no way to explain it away anymore. My dad was a binge drinker, so he would actually go for long periods of time not drinking. But when he did start drinking, he was down for the count. He would just drink to the point of being so drunk that he was completely not functional and eventually would just pass out. From what I understand, his binges didn't last long in the beginning, and they were much fewer and further between than they ultimately became. I guess he would only binge for a day or two early on, but as time went on, his binges became longer, meaning his time fully out of commission became longer and more obvious, and the time he spent sober in between the binges got shorter. Regardless, I was fully unaware of this cycle for years, and it wasn't until my 12th birthday party when I discovered the truth. My actual birthday is the day after Christmas, and since so many people are busy with family or traveling for the holidays at this time of year, we would always have a birthday party for me on June 26th, my half birthday, so that we could utilize the pool and enjoy a fun summer party with friends and family. So on this day, I remember asking my uncle where my dad was, and I just hadn't seen him all day. I hadn't seen him by the pool. He wasn't on the porch grilling, not in the kitchen, not in the basement. And this was pretty strange since we hosted these parties at our house. So he literally lived there. Um, so I asked my uncle about it, and he told me, "Your dad is in the hospital." Naturally, I'm quite surprised to hear this and am concerned that he must have suddenly become very ill or there was an accident or something. And I asked my uncle, why? Why is he in the hospital? And he said, because he's drunk. Now, this made absolutely no sense to me at the time. I didn't really know anything about drinking at this point. I had been honestly pretty sheltered from it. As I said, my dad was a binge drinker, and when he fell off the wagon, he was fully out of commission, laid up in bed, and the drinking was kept hidden and entirely out of sight. But the rest of the time, there was no alcohol in the house. We didn't keep alcohol around at all, and my parents didn't ever drink around us. Obviously, if my dad drank, it would trigger a binge, and my mom just didn't drink. I think mostly out of solidarity and a desire to keep my dad safe from temptation. But yeah, at 12, I had virtually no real exposure to alcohol. And when my uncle said my dad was in the hospital because he was drunk, I just remember thinking, is that what happens to people when they get drunk? They end up hospitalized? I could not make any sense of it. But that was when I was made aware of my father's addiction and how it affected him. I was basically told that he was sick and that alcohol made him sick, and that in order for him to not be sick, he had to go to the hospital. So he was in the hospital detoxing. What's really wild to me, though, is that after I learned this, I started noticing things. So I don't know if his addiction actually took a big turn for the worse at this point, or if it had all just been completely invisible to me in my prior ignorance. But suddenly I was seeing my dad drunk and stumbling around sometimes, slurring his words, acting strange. And I was seeing my mom and sibling upset with him. Usually my mom seeming irritated, embarrassed, disappointed, and my sibling being really harsh and like yelling profanities at him. I actually remember one moment in particular. I think this was shortly after I'd learned he was an alcoholic, where I heard commotion out in the living room. I came out from my bedroom and over to the balcony that looked down over the living room. And my sibling is just screaming at my dad, who's face down on the couch with my mom behind my sibling crying and just looking so distraught. And he apparently had just come in after driving to get more liquor while completely intoxicated. So I guess my sibling had been yelling at him while he walked from the garage through the kitchen and into the living room, where he stopped at the end of the couch, swayed for a moment before he face planted into the couch unconscious. And I witnessed like the very tail end of this scene. And then I retreated back into my room and I sat with my back against the door, just trying to process what I'd seen. And what's weird is that the thought that went through my head, what I remember thinking was, this is like something out of a movie. It's like it didn't feel real to me. I didn't have any I didn't have any context for it, and it just didn't even feel like real life. Um, from that point on, moments similar to that were sprinkled throughout my life. Sometimes way less dramatic, sometimes more so, but the times where he was sober, he tried really hard to just be a normal dad. Unfortunately, his way of trying to connect and show love was usually through taking us on these big fancy vacations or buying us things. There wasn't really any like real emotional connection or support. So, of course, no emotional safety in my relationship with him. We also never spoke about his drinking. He never acknowledged it, never took any accountability, never apologized for the chaos and pain he was causing. It was just never addressed. Nobody talked about how it made them feel or how we were supposed to handle it because it just wasn't talked about at all. Even my mom didn't talk about it. It was as if we were all just pretending it didn't exist. The elephant in the room, one could say. And not only was it never talked about, but throughout my childhood and younger years, I was also being constantly reminded of how good I had it. My mom would often tell me things like, "You're so lucky, you have it so good. Your parents are still together, they both love you so much." Just continually reminding me of things to be grateful for about my life. And as a child, this was really conflicting because I was very close with my mother, still am. I love you, Mom. But we had a very close and loving relationship. And so I trusted her very, very much. So when she would remind me of all these things to be grateful for and would tell me how blessed and fortunate I was, I believed her. Yet simultaneously, I'm experiencing and have been this really traumatic situation with my dad. Even before I knew about his alcoholism and could actually see it playing out in my life, I could still feel it my entire life. Like before I was made aware, I could feel intuitively that something was wrong, something was off about our family. So, this combination of feeling like there's something very wrong about my life while continually being told how good of a life and family I have was extremely confusing and conflicting for me, and in ways that I couldn't possibly make sense of at the time. Now, I would also like to add that I don't hold any of this against my mother whatsoever. She was a victim in this situation and in her relationship with my dad as well. She was experiencing her own trauma, and this was her way of coping. She had to gaslight herself into believing all was well for her own survival. She told me those things to instill that belief within herself, and I don't blame her in any way for what she did for her own survival. That being said, this inner conflict I experienced as a result impacted me greatly, and by the time I was a teenager, I was constantly seeking ways to escape. I started smoking weed and experimenting with other substances, and of course, eventually drinking alcohol when that was accessible. Obviously, as a teenager, I didn't really recognize anything wrong with this. It felt perfectly normal for a person my age to rebel and start experiencing my life and small moments of freedom with a sense of adventure and a bit of risk. Plus, tons of other kids were doing the same thing. It just felt like a totally normal phase of teenage partying. And really, in some ways, it was that. But ultimately, the thing that I wouldn't come to understand for many more years is that I was coping. That whatever I was going through that was too painful, too confusing, too scary to face, I was just running and hiding from. If left to just sit and feel my feelings, it was too devastating. So I was chasing whatever experience, whatever shift in my headspace or mood would take me out of it. This would ultimately be the beginning of a decades-long toxic habit of self-abandonment. Back when this cycle was beginning, it wasn't quite as dangerous or damaging as it would ultimately grow to be. Or maybe in some ways it was. It definitely wasn't the safest coping mechanism and led to me putting myself in some pretty questionable situations throughout my late teen and young adult life. But the point is that at the time, it was about survival. I didn't have the tools or skills or self awareness to know how to handle my experience any differently. And I mean, it's not like I consciously chose to handle it in the way that I did. These were unconscious impulses that came about as an attempt to protect me and shield me from the suffering. And I totally get that. Distraction can be a really useful method sometimes in life, but it just isn't sustainable. I couldn't just go my whole life avoiding having to actually face my pain, as I would eventually come to learn. As many of you have likely heard before, what you resist persists. And I have found this in my own experience to be an absolute truth. The more we put off dealing with something, the more we avoid facing what needs our attention, the more damage it will do. Things don't just go away if we ignore them. It's actually quite the opposite. When we ignore our pain, when we avoid it at all costs and refuse to give it our attention, it's like ignoring a physical wound on our body. It festers. It becomes infected and even more painful than when it first happened. And infections can spread and cause serious damage and complications far beyond the point of where the original wound began. The same thing happens to us mentally, emotionally, and spiritually when we refuse to face our emotional wounds. And ultimately, that's what I did for years. I refused to really sit with my pain in a meaningful way. I continued to run around chasing different highs and distractions, fully believing I was just a free spirit. I was adventurous. I liked to party and have a good time. And these things are true about me. But that made it even harder for me to recognize that this pattern was actually stemming from trauma. I wasn't just some happy go lucky party animal. I was just that same little girl, lost and sad and confused and hurting. Now, this is not to say that I wasn't actually enjoying myself all those years. I was absolutely having the best time a lot of the time, especially in the beginning before my wounds had time to really fester. I honestly don't regret a single moment of my chaotic and messy past. I truly believe that things always play out exactly as they're meant to for us to receive the experiences and lessons that will ultimately benefit us the most. I also know that had anything in my life happened any differently or not happened at all, then I wouldn't be where I am now. And I'm so grateful to be here now, even though I've done things I'm extremely unproud of, as I'm sure most of us have. But throughout that time of my life, I had so many truly magical, awe inspiring, life affirming experiences. But I'm honestly the kind of person who almost always finds magic in the mundane, a quality that I've thankfully carried safely with me since childhood. Not that all of my experiences were mundane, of course. I'm more so just saying that I'm particularly primed for exciting and enchanting experiences just by my nature. But peppered throughout all these spectacular experiences were much less glamorous ones. The messy ones where I spent hours blubbering about my heartache and feeling sorry for myself. The sloppy ones where I made horrible decisions without considering consequences. The scary ones where I blacked out and put myself in really dangerous situations, trusting people I shouldn't or trusting myself with things that I shouldn't. Nights like this would inevitably happen eventually as a result of drinking. In the beginning, it seemed more like the usual acclimating that young people do when they first start drinking. Like, you have to kind of figure out your footing with it and go a little overboard from time to time to learn where your limits are. But I never seemed to really learn mine when it came to alcohol. And over time, the instances of me overdoing it would become more frequent. Then, when I was 25 years old, my dad died. And just 1 week after he died, I found out I was pregnant. Thankfully, I had no problem at all quitting my vices cold turkey and going fully sober. It honestly wasn't even a struggle. I think something about the responsibility I now had to care for an entirely other being and usher their spirit into the physical through my own vessel was a powerful motivator for me. So I went the entirety of my pregnancy sober, but pregnancy proved to be a whole new trauma for me. On top of attempting to process my dad's death, which was clearly a very complex and layered emotional experience for me. I wanted so badly to be one of those pregnant women who's just like so shiny and happy and in love with being pregnant. And that was so far from the experience I ended up having. My pregnancy was absolutely miserable. Fortunately, I was blessed with a very easy pregnancy physically, but mentally and emotionally, I was not okay. I was the most depressed that I had ever been at that point in my life. I believe a lot of this was due to just having a completely unsupportive partner. The father of my son was extremely emotionally immature, manipulative, and selfish. He provided me with virtually no emotional support and would actually make me feel bad for having such a hard time and always find a way to make it about himself. For anyone listening who's been pregnant, you know how insane the hormonal fluctuations can make you feel, and how sometimes you'll just snap and say something with an attitude. I mean, this is also just a perfectly normal human behavior that I think everyone has experienced at some point or another. But it's a pretty well known and understood fact that people dealing with pregnancy hormones are extremely susceptible to this. Well, anytime I would snap with even the slightest attitude, he would immediately snap back louder and harder, starting us into a huge argument. Despite all of the studies and articles that I would send him related to dealing with pregnancy hormones or how to have compassion for your pregnant partner or how to best support your pregnant partner, he refused to acknowledge any of it or even attempt to shift his behavior. If I ever tried to come to him with how I was feeling and try to communicate my needs, he would take it as a personal attack, become super defensive, and we'd end up in a huge, ugly argument. If I was having a particularly hard day, which was honestly most days, and he came home from work and I expressed a need for comfort or support, he would start complaining about his own stuff, like how hard his day had been or how he hadn't been feeling well all day, just completely ignoring my request for care and making it all about him. I remember one day in particular where I was just really going through it. He was at work and I was just at the house, so unbelievably miserable, just so heavy, so heartachy. And I spent the entire day just lying in that bed sobbing. I remember I tried to put on different shows, movies, different things, and nothing could keep my attention. Nothing but this deep, deep sadness and overwhelming sense of emptiness. I didn't even eat that day. I only got up to pee. And I just felt like I was completely falling apart. And I remember feeling a sense of relief when I heard the front door, like, okay, I don't have to be alone in this anymore. And when he came in, he saw me clearly just puddled in a heap of sad on the bed, my face bright red and puffy, still wet with tears. And I looked at him with desperation and said, I'm having a hard time. And he immediately just like threw his hands to his head and grimaced and said, "Oh, well, I've had the worst migraine all day," and walked back into the living room and threw himself dramatically on the couch. I was so confused and hurt. Like, he had clearly been fine when he walked in, but when he saw the terrible condition that I was in, it was almost like he had this compulsion to compete with me for who deserved attention more. It was wild. Anyway, I shared that story just to give you an idea of what I mean when I say I had absolutely no emotional support. I actually started going to therapy for the first time while I was pregnant. I was just struggling so much and felt completely hopeless and alone. And in therapy, I was diagnosed with CPTSD, or complex post traumatic stress disorder, and GAD, which is generalized anxiety disorder, along with my previous childhood diagnosis of ADHD. I spoke a bit about my childhood in therapy and tried to make sense of some things and some feelings, but unfortunately, my therapist was a bit dismissive and didn't really help me with my trauma all that much. It honestly seemed like she thought I was making some of it up, which was really discouraging and confusing, which I may have also misread that, but that is what it felt like to me. And I also just understand that some therapists just aren't the right fit. But I didn't really get a ton out of those sessions. And as soon as I gave birth to my son, I just stopped going to therapy altogether. My reasoning was sort of that pregnancy had just been this really super challenging and isolating experience for me. But once the baby was here, then I'd be all better and I'd have so much to live for and I wouldn't need so much mental health support. Of course, that wasn't true. That was just wishful thinking that I fell for fully believing. I guess it was partially true. I definitely felt a renewed sense of purpose when my son was born. It felt like such an incredible honor to be blessed with the role of caretaker for this innocent, beautiful little soul. And stepping from the role of maiden into the role of the mother felt like this monumental transition that should have felt magical and powerful. But the truth was, I was still so unhealed, and that wounded maiden was never given the proper space and support to grieve and heal. And then to step into the role of mother, so ill prepared, in a culture with no real tradition of meaningful initiation rites, and feeling still so unsupported, this transition ended up creating even more confusion and inner turmoil for me. Not to mention how traumatizing the birth itself ended up being. The first few years of my son's life, I fell into an even deeper depression than I had been in during pregnancy. I truly, for much of the first few years of his life, did not want to be alive, but I loved him, still love him beyond anything in this world, and just absolutely could not bear the idea of abandoning him. Um, when my son's dad decided he wanted to move down to Florida to be in business with his own dad and be near family, I chose to stay in Asheville, North Carolina, where we had been living. I'd lived in Florida on several different occasions throughout my life and just never been truly happy living there. But Asheville was the first place that I'd ever lived to truly feel like home. And I certainly wasn't about to leave it for Florida. But unfortunately, I just did not have the support that I needed in Asheville. And being alone with a newborn with almost no help day to day was terribly lonely. Before becoming pregnant, I felt like I had this huge, incredibly supportive community around me. But once I was pregnant, I realized that many of those people were, well, they were just in different places in their lives than I was. I was going to say they were just party friends, but that's like not really fair to even say, but it's just we had bonded and connected through these experiences that we were sharing together when I was at a different place in my life. So many of them just didn't know how to show up for me in this new experience. And I genuinely don't hold that against any of them. I did have a few friends, though, who did their best to show up and support me and would visit and help out with the baby and just be good company for me. And I really cherished those moments. But between just a few people who also had jobs and events and their own lives that they were still living, I just wasn't provided with nearly the amount of support necessary to care for a baby and not lose my mind. As they say, it takes a village, and I just didn't have that village. I think it's also worth noting that a big part of this isolation was very likely partly my own doing, because I do believe that there absolutely was a stellar family based community out there who would have probably gladly offered the type of support that I was needing. But I was just so trapped in my own despair and depression that I couldn't even really figure out how to engage with it. And this transition from maiden to mother without proper initiation left me feeling wildly insecure and unsure of myself or who I even was. And so I think this was really when a significant shift happened in my relationship with alcohol. Because before pregnancy, I had always drunk in the context of a gathering or event, or at least some sort of hang with another person. But when I was living alone with my baby in Asheville, is when the habit of drinking alone probably first began. It seemed so harmless at first, too. Just a glass of wine at night to wind down every once in a while. But over time, once in a while became almost every day, and one glass became two, became three, became a whole bottle eventually. I was lonely and miserable, and I tried to unsuccessfully drown my sorrow. Eventually, I had ended up moving down to Florida to be with my son's dad. He found a house for the three of us, and I felt like maybe this could actually work and be a good thing. Sadly, I was very wrong about that. I probably should have known that his dad would be of no help, both emotionally and with the baby, since we had spent the first 2 months of our son's life together in Florida with family, and he was entirely unsupportive throughout that whole thing. And I also probably should have known that it would be an unsafe and toxic situation based on previous issues that we'd had where he had become violent. But it's amazing the things our brain will allow us to forgive and forget when we are in a desperate enough situation. So, my son and I lived with his dad in Florida for a few months, and as you might imagine, it was still miserable. There's something even more upsetting and lonely about living with another person, especially the one that you feel like you should be able to count on for support, like the father of your child, only to be met with the reality that you're really in this alone. It was like pulling teeth to get him to just babysit for a few minutes just so I could take a shower alone. Honestly, alone time was basically out of the question entirely because every single thing I did or moment that I had, I was with my baby, since his dad refused to share in any of the parenting responsibilities. On occasion, his family or mine, my mom lived in Florida also, uh, would watch the baby for us, but at home, it was all me all the time. And on top of that, my son's dad was still just the same as he'd been the whole time, extremely emotionally immature, manipulative, and selfish. And I certainly was not perfect. We were caught up in the cycle of keeping interactions super surface level where we actually could get along, then me trying to have actual conversations and communicate about our relationship and things that needed our attention, and then those attempts at communication ultimately breaking down into completely unproductive, toxic, and emotionally damaging arguments. And these arguments continued to escalate with each new cycle until we'd crossed over into the realm of physical abuse. Again, as my lore clearly contains some more sensitive content, I do think I'll make a separate outlet for some of these stories if people are interested in knowing more of the details. But for now, all you need to know is that this experience was just another heavy and painful layer of trauma to add to my already very weighted blanket of trauma. And I was coping with alcohol throughout the whole thing. And what's really messed up is that even though I knew deep down that something was problematic about my drinking, I was simultaneously being bombarded by this seemingly fast growing popularity of wine mom culture. And that is honestly a social phenomenon that I would love to devote a whole episode to deep diving into. But yeah, so essentially, these experiences are what sort of set me up for having a severely problematic relationship to alcohol. I did end up leaving my son's dad and doing the single mom thing for several years, but I unfortunately brought my deeply troubling coping mechanism with me. The next few years were honestly really dark and messy for me. I was still just suffering through the deepest depression I'd ever been in and only making it worse by drinking to cope with it. Then I ended up in an extremely abusive relationship with an alcoholic. That's a whole story for another time and another place, but this was when my drinking became the worst it ever was. Alcohol was one of his tools for manipulation, and he would keep me compliant and malleable by keeping me drunk. Which I know seems like it shouldn't be so easy for someone to force someone else to drink if they really don't want to, but I was so lost and beaten down by life at this point, and he would pressure and sometimes coerce me into drinking, and I honestly didn't have the self-love or confidence to argue it, and I was already very familiar with using it as a coping mechanism. So yeah, this guy ended up being a textbook abuser. He isolated me and cut me off from my friends and family, trying to convince me they were all bad people who didn't really care about me or that they were out to get me somehow. He would wear me down psychologically by being extremely cruel, saying completely made up things just to hurt me and make me feel worthless and unlovable. He would gaslight me. He would pressure me to do things that I wasn't comfortable with. And if I ever pointed out or even tried to bring up the mistreatment, he would completely deny it and flip it all around and try to convince me that I was actually the abuser and he was the victim. At some point, towards the end of that relationship, I did have a sort of moment of clarity where I could feel my truest and purest self, my higher self, calling out to me from beneath all the weight of the pain and suffering, telling me that I wanted more, that I deserved more, that it didn't have to be like this. In that moment, I decided to stop drinking and start caring for my physical health. I started doing yoga every day and eating healthier, and I was still really wrapped up in this relationship. It's so hard to explain my thought process at the time, but I just really hoped that my partner would see me starting to thrive and choose to make a change for himself as well. But he was far too gone. This guy drank an ungodly amount of straight whiskey every single day, all day. I mean, I'd been alongside him for a lot of it, but I think he'd been doing this for years before he came into my life. He was deep, deep in it, a depth that I, very fortunately, had yet to reach and ultimately never would. Anyway, I tried to shift these patterns for myself, but my efforts at this point were too superficial to make any lasting impact. Just stopping drinking and doing yoga wasn't nearly enough when I'm still in the thick of an abusive relationship and incapable of admitting it to anyone, including myself. So, after about a week and a half, I caved to his protests and slipped right back into the old familiar cycle of drinking, then feeling ashamed of my choices and the way I was living my life, and drinking more to cope. I did eventually try to make him leave, but he basically refused to be broken up with. The pandemic had just started, and unsurprisingly, he had nowhere else to go. He had burned every single bridge in his life, and because of that, it wasn't like he could just hit up a friend and go crash on their couch. So when I told him I was done and he needed to leave, he threw a huge fit telling me how evil I am for just throwing him out onto the streets during a global pandemic. So I told him he could stay the night, but in the morning, he needed to make arrangements somehow and figure out somewhere to go. But then, the next morning, I woke up to him cooking a nice big breakfast, making coffee, being super sweet and playful with my son, basically playing the role of the perfect boyfriend, and completely disregarding the conversation we'd had the previous night. And because he had such a tendency to fly off the handle, I didn't want to address it again when my son was around. So I knew that I was going to have to wait until my son was in bed asleep later that night before reminding him, my now ex boyfriend, hey, this relationship is over and you have to leave. So the whole day was super nerve wracking because I sort of just had to play along and also like build up the courage to break up with this guy again. So finally, my son was in bed, and I readdressed the conversation from the night before, and it played out basically exactly the same. He threw a huge fit and played the victim, trying to get my sympathy by saying that I'm making him homeless while there's a deadly virus going around. And again, of course, I agreed that he should stay the night as long as he left the very next morning. But yet again, the next day, I wake up into the very same scene from the day before. So again, I had to spend the whole day preparing myself for a really uncomfortable interaction with an extremely unstable man. And this exact pattern went on for 8 days. And every night when I'd remind him that I was really done and he really actually had to leave, his reactions became more and more aggressive and violent. Thankfully, during this time, I had received some messages from a local photographer who had been trying to arrange a photo shoot with me. I had honestly been sort of blowing him off for 2 years at this point, not because I wasn't interested in collaborating, but truthfully, because I was so unwell mentally and extremely insecure at that time in my life. Or that was the reasoning at first, whether or not I was consciously aware of it at the time. But then when I was caught up in this abusive relationship, there was no way I could go and model for some other guy. My ex was extremely jealous and possessive, so I basically had to keep postponing these tentative plans for a photo shoot. But by some miracle, this failed attempt at making plans would ultimately serve as my escape from this toxic situation that I couldn't seem to get myself out of. This photographer messaged me at some point during this never ending twilight zone of a breakup to see if I had any availability coming up for a shoot. I basically told him, like, look, I'm really sorry. I haven't really meant to be so flaky on you. I have a lot going on over here, and I honestly don't know when I'll be able to do a photo shoot. And he was super understanding. He's like, no problem. Just let me know if it's ever something you might like to do, and kind of, gave me his schedule. Then he sent me a follow up message asking, is everything okay over there? And so at this point, I hadn't been honest with anyone about what I'd been going through. I was essentially disconnected from all my friends, and I was too ashamed to tell my family. But this guy, he was just some photographer who shared a few mutual friends and acquaintances with me. We'd never met in person. So when he asked me if everything was okay, it somehow seemed safe to tell him. Like, I didn't really know the guy, so what did I have to lose? So what if he judged me for my situation or was freaked out or just totally blew me off? It's not like it would be ruining a friendship or anything. So it felt pretty low risk. And so I decided to open up to this friend of a friend photographer who was, of course, extremely concerned and extremely supportive. He gave me his number and told me that the next time my ex got out of hand or was getting aggressive or scary in any way, to just give him a call and he would come and get me and my son out of there. Well, the next day, when my ex was playing perfect boyfriend and seeming to conveniently forget what that he'd been broken up with and asked to leave for the last 8 nights in a row, I finally had the courage to just say something in the moment. I couldn't keep waiting until the nighttime to remind him of what the situation actually was. And of course, it went terribly. He immediately starts to throw a huge fit, screaming at me, calling me all sorts of names. And while he's absolutely losing it at me, I pick up my phone to call the photographer. When he answers, I don't even have to say anything because he can hear the tantrum of a grown man in the background. All he says is, send me your address, I'll be right there. Upon realizing there was a man coming to pick me up, my ex locked himself in a room and hid because despite the fact that he would always talk all this big talk about how he would never hesitate to harm someone who crossed him, he was all talk. And honestly, I think that he probably knew his behavior had been so out of line that it was pretty likely someone would actually have it out for him. So eventually there was a knock at the door, and when I opened it up, that would be the first time I ever laid eyes on the man who would later become my husband. Which is a really great story in and of itself, but today I really just wanted to take you through some of the key experiences that I believe played the biggest roles in me developing such a toxic relationship with alcohol. It began as a coping mechanism, a way to distract myself and escape from the painful confusion of my home life. Then it was the familiar comfort and justified, well-deserved wind down of a single mother who was also just trying to escape. Then it was the mechanism that kept me trapped in a cycle of abuse and believing it's what I deserved. It became a huge and heavy source of shame, yet I still reached for it to cope with that shame. still just trying to escape. What I will say is that I wasn't fully oblivious to this cycle. Even though it was definitely something I was very caught up in, I knew for so long, deep down, that I wanted out. I wanted to stop. But it felt so impossible for so many reasons. And on top of that, the part of me that bought into the illusion of alcohol didn't actually want to stop. It felt like such an integral part of my life. And I was still able to have some really fantastic times that included alcohol, where I felt like drinking actually did enhance the experience. So I kept trying to convince myself that I just needed to figure out how to moderate, because stopping drinking entirely would take away so many wonderful opportunities for a good, fun time. And I definitely didn't want the FOMO. Sobriety just didn't seem worth it when considering all the good times that I'd had that included alcohol. But if I really zoomed out and considered all of the experiences that included alcohol, it was so clear that the bad far outweighed the good. Drinking wasn't worth it. Because for me, with everything that I'd been through in my dark, toxic, and complicated relationship with alcohol, there was just no way for me to engage with it without experiencing shame. And the older I was getting, the more crippling it became. Even on nights where I drank a moderate amount, had a lovely time, managed not to overdo it or make an ass out of myself, I would still wake up the next day with horrible anxiety. And in general, in my day-to-day life, I had become an extremely anxious person, even prone to having panic attacks. Alcohol was just absolutely wrecking my mental health. It caused me to be in a constant state of fight or flight. It caused me to get caught up in constant shame spiraling. It caused me to start hating who I was. It caused me to lose touch with myself, with my spirituality, my spark, my magic. And it was so hard for me to come to terms with that. On the one hand, deep down, I knew these things. But on the other, I was just too attached to the idea that alcohol should still have a place in my life. So I kept trying to force it to fit, even though my tendency to overdo it and black out had caused almost irreparable damage to my relationship. I tried desperately to convince my husband and myself that I could keep it under control, that I was capable of moderating. And I actually was capable of moderating sometimes, but it was so stressful. The entire time, my brain would just be obsessing over drinking, like wondering how long I should wait between drinks, or whether having three is too many, or maybe if I wait long enough after my second, a third won't seem like too much to anybody else. Just constant mental chatter solely revolved around alcohol and whether I was doing a good enough job fitting in with all the other normal drinkers. And if I managed to go a whole night in successful moderation, I would still wake up a nervous wreck. And if I didn't succeed in moderating and ended up having one or three or five too many, I would wake up just absolutely miserable, riddled with shame and crippling anxiety that fueled very disturbing and harmful thoughts. Whenever people ask me why I don't drink anymore, my most common response is, I finally realized that I hate the way alcohol makes me feel about myself. And that's the truth, as simply as I can say it. I couldn't continue living my life as someone I wasn't proud of. And I realized that if I ever wanted to be able to show up fully for myself and my loved ones, to truly live my life wholeheartedly and thrive, that alcohol couldn't be a part of that equation. All right. I know this was a heavy one, and I just want to thank you for being here and letting me share my story with you. It means so much to me to have the opportunity to share my experience and hopefully make a difference and provide healing for not only myself, but whoever my story touches. If this spoke to you at all, I would love for you to come back and join me for the next episode where I'll be discussing how my recovery journey began and the rituals and practices that help me stay grounded and committed to healing. Until then, remember, you are not alone, and there is always light at the surface.